Greetings from Washington. My name is Andrew J. Tabler. I am the Martin J. Gross Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and former Syria Director at the U.S. National Security Council and Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of State. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this very timely policy forum entitled Trip Report, Next Steps for U.S. Policy. Nearly a half a year since the fall of the Assad regime, Syria's transitional government has settled into its new role, and some of its officials are making their first trips to the United States for talks with the IMF, World Bank, and the United Nations. Meanwhile, Washington continues to debate the appropriate level of engagement with the new authorities and the extent to which it is willing to ease sanctions. To better contextualize the situation, Aaron Zelin, to my right, the Washington Institute's Gloria and Ken Levy Senior Fellow and author of the book, The Age of Political Jihadism, a study of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, recently traveled to Syria and gleaned on-the-ground insights that can help inform upcoming U.S. policy decisions there. And to mark his recent return, the Institute is pleased to host this policy forum, not only with Dr. Zelin, but also with Gareth Browne of The Economist, who I believe is joining with us today from Beirut, and who has been reporting from Syria since the regime's fall, and Caroline Rose to my left of the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, who also recently traveled to Syria. At the end of, we're going to have a series of questions here. At the end of our presentations, we're going to have a question and answer. If you would like to ask questions to our panelists during the event, throughout the event, as things come up, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, that's policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Great. So welcome to everyone. We have about 3 rounds of questions, and then we'll go to the Q&A, as I mentioned. Aaron, I'd like to start with you. I'd like to ask you to, briefly to set the table for our discussions by outlining your overall observations during your recent visit to Damascus. And, generally, and these are just my off-the-cuff questions. What surprised you? What disappointed you? What new things should we expect? And then, if you can expand from there into the policy realm, and that is the Trump administration reportedly recently extended 8 points to the Syrian authorities, which they reportedly answered last month, and has led to a number of clarifications. These are not publicly available, but have been written about extensively. Which of these will be easy for Damascus to address, and which will be the hardest? Over to you.
Great. Thanks for everybody watching online. So I was in Syria for 8 days, obviously not a ton of time. So I was only restricted to having time to go to about 5 of the provinces, Damascus, Rif Dimashq, Hama, Homs, and Sweda. So what I say is, limited to my experiences there. And obviously it would have been great if I was there longer to go to the Northeast as well. But that's an important caveat. While I was there, I was able to meet, ministers, deputy ministers, businessmen, religious leaders, NGOs, journalists, as well as just day-to-day interactions. And I should also thank Gareth, since he helped facilitate some of these meetings too. Not necessarily a surprise, but one of the first things many people have asked since I've, returned from Syria is whether I actually felt safe there or comfortable. And to be honest, it felt relatively normal. I didn't have any issues with anybody once when I was on the ground, even at checkpoints. Usually I was just pushed through, never asked to see a passport or anything along those lines. And even, the HTS security guys that one might see on the news and maybe deem scary looking, they could honestly care less when I said that I was American, like totally unfazed by it. One of the things I was impressed by, though, was sort of the way that the government dealt with security on the ground, especially vis-a-vis minorities. I was actually there during Good Friday and Easter, and you could see that they really beefed up the security related to those areas in Damascus and the communities and the holiday celebrations that they were doing. And even after the holidays, the day after when the kids were going back to school again, you could see a larger presence of security as well. I should also note that I had the opportunity to go to Sayyida Zainab, which is, of course, a Shia shrine. And it's the only place the whole time I was in Syria that somebody asked me to check a bag because I think they were worried that, somebody could potentially do like a suicide attack or something along those lines, since there's obviously a prior plot related to the Islamic State in January. I guess one of the things that surprised me the most was that even though I've seen all of the horrible images and videos of the destruction, seeing it in person was quite astounding in a bad way, way worse than I could have imagined. And it's incredible how close it is to the city center in Damascus, too. Maybe a half a mile to a mile away. So everybody clearly knew what the former regime was doing. One of the things, though, that I didn't consider until I was actually on the ground was that some people have actually started to move back into some of these ruins. So even though a third of the buildings in the country are destroyed, some people are trying to move back in. And when we're thinking about reconstruction issues, it's obviously a huge challenge, because if they're trying to move all this rubble or like buildings that clearly are not probably stable, it could displace people again. And I'm not sure people have really thought about that yet. In terms of one of the things that I think, I wouldn't necessarily say a disappointment, but something of note that, could be perceived as negative, is the fact that the foreign minister's political affairs director, it seems to be controlling much of the bureaucracy domestically too. So while he's, putting on this charm offensive abroad, a lot of the government is going through the foreign ministry now as well. And I had some interesting experiences related to this in terms of, if you're in a meeting with somebody, they might want to call the foreign ministry ahead of time to make sure that it was okay to say anything. So that was definitely an interesting experience, to say the least. And then finally, on your last point about the U.S. asks, I mean, a lot of them, I think the government has been doing already, whether it's related to the fight against ISIS, whether it's issues on, going after Hezbollah remnant cells and sort of the infrastructure built up during the war when it was assisting Assad. We've seen it take on the Captagon trade, and I'm sure Caroline will have way more to say about that. They are working with OPCW on sort of the chemical weapons issue, though they definitely need help with destroying it, since I'm unsure they have the technical capacity to do it, which is a place that the U.S. could potentially, assist with, since the U.S., of course, destroyed some of the chemical weapons of the Assad regime after the 2013 deal between Obama and Putin. But I think the most difficult one will be the issue of foreign fighters. Not necessarily surprising, considering the fact that some of these guys were key components of, the military apparatus of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, prior to the fall of the regime. And while it is of concern, thus far we've seen evidence that if certain foreign fighters, go against certain red lines, then the new government has acted against them, whether it was this Egyptian guy named Ahmed al-Mansour, who tried to create a whole new group to overthrow the Sisi regime in Egypt. They arrested the guy after 2 or 3 days of him spouting stuff off online. Then when we saw, people trying to destroy a Christmas tree during Christmas, I think there were some like Uzbeks or something along those lines, they're also arrested. And if you're also looking at like cultural issues, of course, we recently saw some people being arrested when some of them tried to go into a club to break things up. And so, at least for now, it seems that it hasn't been an issue in terms of things abroad. But of course, it makes sense that there's concerns from the outside, just because of the history of foreign fighters and so on and so forth, going back to Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's see, Caroline, over to you to address the same, basically questions based on your recent trip, but I know that you focused a lot on Captagon and possible U.S. withdrawal, so feel free to throw that in as well.
Certainly. Well, first off, I just want to say it's pretty incredible being here and talking about a post-regime Syria with really everyone on this panel. We've worked in some shape or form before on Syria policy, so it's a really great opportunity to talk about not only this trip but also steps moving forward. So I was in Damascus only. I was not able to go to the countryside and go explore other provinces, unfortunately. This was my first trip, not my last trip. But so the scale and the scope of my trip is a bit more limited than what I think Aaron and Gareth have. But in my time in Damascus, I was able to meet with many different officials, both involved in the interim government as well as civil society leaders and different religious officials. So I was able to get, I think, a decent view of where Damascus is at, where it's trying to push for sanctions relief and new reforms. From the moment my plane landed on the tarmac at Damascus International Airport, it was clear the infrastructural needs for a post-regime Syria. The tarmac was cracked. You could see off in the distance the emergency vehicles that they use for example, putting out fires and emergency services. They were all completely out of commission. It was very clear that the airport itself also, there were several improvements infrastructurally that were needed. Also, of course, with Syria's aviation sector, there are only just a few flights leaving Damascus every day. Security at the airport is very tight, but for only 2 to 3 or 4 different flights that are leaving, it was quite impressive. Being in Damascus, speaking with officials, something that did surprise me, and it was something that I think every analyst, they know, they're told this, they engage with this when they're speaking with people who've recently been on the ground, but it still was a shock to me how just overloaded and under-resourced this new interim government is. One particular official showed me their phone and their WhatsApp messages. Just the overview, the list of what they've received in the last 2 hours, and it was around 400, 500 messages in just 2 hours of not checking his phone. So to me, it's quite unbelievable how they've been able to function and conduct this shuttle diplomacy campaign while being so severely under-resourced, undermanned, and of course, overloaded with all of these different requests. I think when raising several issues about reconstruction efforts, sanctions relief, what would need to be done, especially for expectations from the United States Department of State, they're all aware of this, and I think that they have an idea, a roadmap, and a strategy in place. But again, it's the execution that I think that they're struggling with, in part, of course, to the under-resourcing, but then also, of course, to the fact, and I think we'll get to this a bit, I think the sectarian clashes recently, it's an interesting example of this where it's very reactionary, and it's very de facto planning. They have the right idea, they know what needs to be done, they know the expectations, but when it comes to quelling violence, trying to encourage an inclusive multi-sectarian form of governance, I think that's where they're encountering many challenges. Now, on the subject of Captagon, that was something that I spoke with a number of different officials. Again, there's the willingness to share information. They know that intelligence exchange could be a very positive thing for Syria, especially with regional integration and normalization. But it's a matter of capacity. They have data. They have a lot of officers and a lot of law enforcement officials that are willing to give information. But it's really just a matter of identifying who, assembling a task force, and putting together a more comprehensive counter-narcotic strategy. I think that eventually we'll get there, but so far what we've seen, it's been very seizure heavy and interdiction heavy. Whenever there's a big fish to catch, or a large laboratory to seize and expose, they'll do that. They'll draw back the curtain for journalists and for the public to see. They'll point their fingers at the regime, but after that, there's not much follow through, especially when trying to target the networks that have now gone to the south and now have started to operate in the Bekaa Valley and along the Lebanese-Syrian border, which I think is going to be a more long-term challenge for this interim government, especially as they're trying to quell internal security challenges. And I'll leave that there.
Sure. Great. Thanks very much, Caroline. Yeah, I mean, your observations about the WhatsApp messages, there's, in DC, we have a real concern about, much has been made of the degree to which the government is inclusive of non HTS members. But some of it actually gets just down to capacity. You have to be able to delegate and then maybe eventually share power with others in order to administer the country. And I think the degree of centralization probably leads itself to excess WhatsApping and I'm sure lots of other communication devices. But anyways, I won't linger on that. Gareth, over to you in Beirut. You've spent a lot of time in Syria the last few months, interviewed President Ashara himself. So with Aaron and Caroline's comments in mind, what have been the most radical changes since the Assad regime's collapse? And what have been the constants? And with an eye towards the 8 points that Washington has extended, are there ones that you think will be more difficult to address than others?
Thanks for having me on this forum. I think, like many journalists in the region, I'd covered Syria, from afar, largely for the last decade or so. I had one trip to Damascus in 2018, which was sort of closely monitored by the Assad regime, and maybe half a dozen trips into the SDF territories during the war against ISIS. And I woke up on December the 8th in a state of disbelief, having checked Twitter. And my instinct was to jump in a taxi, drive to the Masna border crossing. I was stamped out of Lebanon, and I went to try and find the Syrian border crossing, and there was no one there except a taxi driver who said, don't worry about it. I'll take you to Damascus for $100. And, within probably about 10 hours of Assad fleeing the country, I was in Damascus in a completely new country, a country I thought I knew well. And I spent, the vast majority of my time on the ground in Syria since then. I've spent a lot of time in Idlib, in Aleppo, Damascus, of course, down in Deraa, Suwaida, but a lot of time in the coastal regions and Latakia, Tartus, Banias. I was in Latakia when the sectarian violence broke out. It's about 2 months ago now. So I've really tried to get out of Damascus as much as possible, as much as my reporting has allowed me to. And part of it, as you mentioned, I was part of a team that interviewed President al-Shara, his first interview after declaring himself president. And I was also involved in some polling that we did, some national polling, which gave a kind of rare data set for the country. Now, I think one of the most obvious things that struck you, particularly in the first 2 months, was the political freedom. You had this country where, freedom of speech just hadn't been a thing for 54 years of Ba'athist rule. And suddenly this gift was bestowed upon a nation. And it was incredible to hear people sitting in cafes, speaking about everyone, everything, using 4-letter words about the president and even the president's mother. You really had to pinch yourself that you were overhearing these things sometimes and sort of looking around saying, should we be having this conversation? Now, I think after about 2 months, that sort of euphoria gave way to reality. And the thing that is most crippling when you're in Damascus, the most obvious thing you see is the poverty, which is, essentially a direct result of the economic sanctions. And it's not strange to see men in what were once well-tailored suits. Perhaps in another age, they were lawyers or doctors, rifling through bins, eating banana skins. Other men and women who can't get to work because they can't get enough petrol to put money in the car. And that has really seeped into everything. I think that's a drag on daily life in Damascus, but I also think it feeds into the government's capacity issues. Now, if we look at the bureaucracy, the administration, I think you have Shara and the people around him absolutely did not expect to be running Damascus. And I don't think when they took Aleppo or in the run up to Aleppo, they ever really thought that Damascus would fall so quickly. So in some ways, they were very much unprepared to run the whole country. And I think we've seen that there's been a centralization of power within the president's office. And really, there's probably about half a dozen people making decisions in the country. And you will hear this time and time again. You can maybe run Idlib, which was a massively overpopulated corner province of Syria, ethnically homogenous. You cannot run the rest of the country like that. And I think they have these massive capacity issues, but probably they haven't helped themselves with trying to centralize things. They have brought in people from outside. More technocratic figures have been placed in key ministries, the foreign ministry, the justice ministry. These are people with sort of Muslim Brotherhood or backgrounds linked to slightly different strands of Islamism, or who were just part of the revolution over the years. And I think if you look at the appointment of Osama al-Rifai, who was, Grand Mufti, he certainly over the years was no friend of HDS and very critical of al-Shara at some point. So there's indications there that they are willing to broaden it. I think, generally speaking, I think there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic. Al-Shara and the people around him have made some mistakes, but they've shown that they're responsive to criticism. But I think everything we're going to talk about on a policy level is backstopped by sanctions. And that's an issue that really squeezes the life out of everything, both politically and on an everyday basis in Syria at the minute, from what I've seen.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gareth. I was thinking a little bit earlier about your comments about being in meetings and then suddenly a call having to be sent over to the foreign ministry to ask if it's okay to address certain issues. It's led to actually some recent talk that actually Shaybani, the foreign minister, is in as a sort of de facto prime minister. And this gets to the capacity and lack of diversity and decentralization inside of the new Syrian government. So let's shift a little bit here to events of the last 10 days or so. In fact, over the last week, there have been clashes between the interim government forces and Syria's Druze community, and they've captured a lot of headlines all over the world, as well as other attacks on restaurants and nightclubs in Syria, killing at least 2 women. And Aaron, let's start out with you. In your view, what is driving these incidents? Is it the government or rogue elements? And what does this say about Ashara's degree of control over the new Syria?
I mean, I think it goes to one of the comments that Caroline made about the government being very reactive in many respects in responding to events, not really the ones initiating them. And you could say that pretty much happened with the incidents in Germana and Sachnia, and then later in Sweden related to the Druze community, where there was an alleged video leaked online where one of the Druze sheikhs was saying something that was interpreted by many in the Sunni community as blasphemous. That led to some people to go to the Druze neighborhoods in Damascus to try and make a deal out of it. And that led then to some violence between these folks. But it's also important to contextualize that when we talk about the Druze community, there isn't just one opinion, there's multiple factions within it. And we've seen during sort of the aftermath of this violence that you kind of have some of the sheikhs that are willing to work with the new government. And then one in particular, Hekmat al-Hijri, who's been more rejectionist in fashion and sort of not wanting to deal with them at all. And so the new government in the aftermath of this has been doing a series of consultations with the communities and trying to bring in their own security forces into the area, as well as take away weapons that had been stored up there. Because one of the policies that the new government's been trying to do is to get a monopolization on violence again, like any government usually tries to do. But it's easier said than done because of the history of the war, as well as many communities being uncomfortable with the new situation and wanting to make sure that they safeguard their own rights before they give up any weapons or not. And so it's kind of been a jagged kind of situation, depending on the particular specifics you're talking about. I think we can say, though, that in this most recent incident, in the Damascus neighborhoods, as well as in Sweden, there was some lessons learned to the massacre that happened on March 6th, 2 months ago now, related to the Alawites, where then you saw sort of this general mobilization for people to get involved. And this time you didn't see anything along these lines. And of course, it's tragic that there are any, civilian deaths, but unlike when there were hundreds of Alawites that were killed a couple of months ago, based off of the information that's come out publicly now, 4 have died, unfortunately. And most of the people that were killed were either on the government side or from these Druze militia that were part of the war. And then in terms of the club incidents, I mean, while they both happen at clubs, they both should be viewed in different lights. One of them was actually, you saw that people in the new government security forces going into the club and trying to break things up. I assume that for whatever reason, they decided to do that because of, people were drinking, I assume, and, men and women were together. But the next day, the government actually arrested these folks. And so it's, seen as sort of like, we're not doing this. This isn't a government policy type of thing, at least for now. And then the second incident, based off of the information that's come out, it seems like it was a personal dispute, and it was like an honor killing type of situation. And it just so happened that the person that was killed, it happened in a club, but it wasn't specific to a club itself, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Caroline, what are your thoughts on these recent events?
So I was there when these clashes were ensuing right outside of Damascus and Sethnia. And then I left right before we started to see strikes conducted on some of these areas. I think that certainly, and I think Aaron described this perfectly in the sense of this has to do with a lack of capacity within the new interim government's ranks. There was a delayed response, but there was a response. And I think this time, the nature of that strategy and that response did reflect some lessons learned from Latakia, as well as a general hesitation and considerations that have been made from, for example, the Kurds in the Northeast. I think that they have looked at the violence that ensued in Latakia along coastal regions, and they have been voicing more and more concerns, especially as in respect to the new deal between Damascus and the SDF. I think that, moving ahead, the interim government knows that this is going to continue to happen cyclically. We may not necessarily see large outbreaks and violence like we saw just a few months ago along the coast, as well as in the South and Druze communities. But I think they understand that now so many different sectarian communities and minority communities are concerned, and represents a huge flashpoint for the interim government. So I think that, but as Gareth mentioned as well, I think that this is a resourcing issue and a manpower issue. And as it stands, there's limited resources and capacity for the interim government to try and fix this immediately due to sanctions that are in place and also other capacity issues.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Caroline. So Gareth, you've been covering Syria intensively, and you've actually interviewed President al-Sham. In light of those experiences, and perhaps even your own work that's either been come out or is in works, how do you view these recent events? Are they different? The more recent events with the Druze, as opposed to the clashes on the Syrian coast, which happened in March? What are the similarities? What are the differences?
Yeah, I do see them quite differently, and I see al-Shara's government's reaction to them quite different. I think if you look at the violence that happened in the coastal areas where, we had 1,400, many of them were Alawite civilians killed. I think the really shocking thing about that episode was the ease and the speed with which Sunni civilians from Aleppo countryside, Hama countryside, and Homs countryside answered calls and basically took up arms, took justice into their own hands, and committed a lot of those atrocities. As much as armed factions were involved, it was the ease with which civilians flipped and participated in the sectarian violence. And actually I don't think it's realistic to expect a country which has been through 14 years of sectarian trauma to wake up on December the 8th, December the 9th, and for sectarianism to just have been vanquished. When we talk about it in the policy world, we like to look at what the government or certain, religious preachers are doing regarding sectarian. Is al-Shara projecting a sectarian government? Personally, I don't think he is. Having spent time with him, I think he understands that Syria is a country that it's a patchwork. That's a horrible cliche, which I will never write in print, so don't fire me. But he gets that, and he understands, I think, that Syria just won't function without all its minorities. And the moment you try to exclude or eject one of these minority groups from Syria, the country, the state really starts to fail, and probably quite violently. And I think in the coastal areas, you had that sectarian spark, which was, fueled by a lot of people acting on recent decades, where if you were a Sunni from the north of the country and your brother had been tortured or your sister had been imprisoned, the chances are it was done by an Alawite officer was involved. So there was this sort of disdain for a certain community, which had built up over time, and it just exploded. And Shara's government was very, very slow to react, and they should have done a lot more. Were they directing people and saying, go to the coast and conduct sectarian killings against the Alawites. I don't think that's the case, and I don't think there's evidence for that. I think, the situation in the last few weeks relating to the Druze and, the kind of clashes in Jarmana and in Suwaid are a bit different. I mean, I think you can see splits within those communities. There were Druze fighters fighting on the side of the HDS-led government during those clashes. And now you have, a small but kind of vocal number of fighters and one cleric in particular who are sort of publicly talking about aligning with Israel. But that's certainly not the mainstream. That's very controversial on the ground in Syria. So I don't think Assad, I don't think that President al-Shara has any interest in fueling the sectarian violence. I think he's been slow to deal with it at times. But I would also say that sometimes these events can also offer an opportunity. And we look at what Murhaf Abu Kasra, who's the Minister of Defense, is trying to, as Caroline said, develop this monopoly on violence. And I think him and people around him thought that the momentum of the military victory, taking Aleppo and Damascus, in a matter of days, would sort of carry them through to this state building process, and they would be able to use that momentum to bring all the armed groups under the control of a new Syrian National Army, and that just hasn't worked. But, a few weeks back we saw sort of clashes beginning in Dera. Ahmed al-Aude, he was one of these sort of Sunni tribal warlords, and people often pointed to him as a potential Haftar-like figure, someone that foreign powers might back if they didn't want to align with al-Shara's government. And what looked like it could develop into clashes was actually dealt with very quickly. And as a result, a few weeks later now, Ahmed al-Aude's men are largely members of the Syrian army. So sometimes these sparks sort of give the government impetus to incorporate, various armed factors. And I think we're seeing that in Suwaida now with, some of the Druze armed factions have come on board with the government's new army. So every incident is different, but I don't think al-Shara is foolish enough to think that he can blaze his way into a sectarian government. I just haven't seen evidence of that.
Okay. Well, sort of along the lines of trying to incorporate other groups into a future administration, at least of Syria. Recently, the United States announced that it began to consolidate its forces in northeast Syria, with other reports leading to the possibility of a withdrawal of U.S. troops in the not too distant future. Given these recent events, is al-Shara and the interim administration capable of administering and controlling northeast Syria? What kind of changes might be necessary to extend the interim government's control? And until now, it seems that al-Shara has been unwilling to share power with other armed and civil society groups. Aaron, will the recent clashes make this more or less likely?
I think it's a really complicated issue that is going to take time. Of course, there was the agreement between Shara and Mazloum Abdi, the head of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, about 2 months ago now, in the aftermath of the massacre on the coast. And while they said that they're going to try and resolve everything by the end of this year, I can imagine a scenario where it'll take much longer. There has been positive momentum, and many people thought that this could just be like a paper agreement, but there have been a number of follow-up meetings, setting up subcommittees related to different issues on military, economics, and administration. We've, of course, seen the deal in the Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo, where the new government's been able to take over. And then now, more recently, the deal on the Tishreen Dam issue, which has more or less ended the war between the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army and the SDF. And so they've kind of neutralized that in some ways. So there have already been some successes in just the past 2 months. The newest reports, in many ways, in light of the U.S. repositioning forces as well as drawing them down in the last few weeks, is that it appears that the new Syrian government's also going to be starting to enter into the western part of Deir ez-Zor province. And I think, in many ways, what's been going on so far has been the easiest part of these potential deals. two neighborhoods in Aleppo. And then when you think about Deir ez-Zor or getting into like al-Raqqa, these are Arab majority areas. So I think there will be less issues and tensions related to the new government taking over those areas. I think once we start talking about Hasaka, which is sort of the core of a lot of the Kurdish populations, is that there will be more challenges, and it could look more similar to some of the back and forth we've seen, I guess, in regards to whether or not Sweda is fully incorporated into the new Syrian administration. I must say, when I was there, it felt like you were almost in another country when you're in Sweda, because there's very little presence of the Syrian government. Of course, this could have changed now in the aftermath of the clashes that happened last week. And so I think that will be very difficult in some ways to manage, especially since there's sort of different visions for the future of the Syrian state between the central government and those related to the SDF and the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, which is the main civilian body that controls it. It's important to remember that prior to the fall of the regime, there was essentially three systems. There was the regime system, there was the HTS system with their civilian salvation government, and then there was the SDF and the Autonomous Administration. And so they actually had their own, administration going on for like 10 years or so. And so integrating that will be much more complicated than just HTS taking over sort of the ashes of the Assad system in many ways. And so hopefully through these subcommittees, they'll be able to come up with deals. But because the central government's more for a central approach, whereas the Kurds seem more interested in like federalism, there definitely will have to be a lot of give and take there. And it's also important to remember that when HTS first took over Northwest Syria back in like 2017, it took them like 2 to 3 years to still consolidate control over just that area. Now we're talking about the entire country. And so I think it would be a bit much to try and hold them necessarily to everything being resolved by December. I think it could take a lot longer, especially on the Hasaka issue. But hopefully on both sides, they're willing to negotiate and come up with a deal that maybe neither side is happy with, and therefore it being the best possible deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Caroline, you've done a lot of work on Northeast Syria, as well as the implications of a U.S. withdrawal from Northeast Syria. What's your opinion on this? Is the government in Damascus capable of taking over the territories you know so well?
I think that they're capable, but like Aaron just said, and I completely agree with him on this, there needs to be greater space for these negotiations to take place. After the initial jubilation and joy that came from the signal that this deal created, the unification of the SDC and the new interim government in Damascus, I think everyone woke up and recognized that a year to deliberate and separate all of these different negotiations into different, quote, baskets, that was going to be a very difficult task, given the fact that there was not necessarily consensus shared between the SDC and the new interim government about what this system would look like. And that includes not only with integration of security systems and security reforms, but also just basic principles of governance. There still is a debate over, confederalism or a federalist model. There are still examples being thrown out, particularly within the SDC, of the KRG model in Iraq. And there are critics of that have said that is not a model that would necessarily work in the Northeast. Within the security sector, there have been calls to make the SDF kind of like the Iraqi counterterrorism service, as the CTS, or a Kurdish security force. And these are all models that I think are still being deliberated, but I do have concerns about these negotiations souring over a lack of consensus. And I think that would be very much a missed opportunity, given the fact that over the course of the counter-ISIS mission, the SDF has been one of the most effective partners for U.S. forces on the ground in Operation Inherent Resolve. When you look at quarterly Office of Inspector General reports, the SDF continuously, they're showing improvements in ISR, which is, compiling intelligence and reconnaissance. They're working more independently of U.S. air cover and U.S. Intelligence provision. However, that being said, doctrinally, they're different from HTS. And I think the HTS, they've also proven themselves to be a successful counterterrorism fighting force. And I think certainly there are lessons to be learned and to be shared between both forces. But at the same time, I think there's going to be a lot of work to be done to share and create consensus over doctrine and over security reform. And of course, I think Aaron and Gareth, I'm sure, can attest to this as well. Amidst all of this maneuvering, Turkey trying to build out the T4 air base. We have also a distraction between different governmental forces, but trying to initiate these reforms. Daesh, they're trying to exploit these distractions and create space for some gains of their own. And so I think that is something certainly that we need to monitor while these talks are taking place, how to sustain gains against ISIS in the Badia.
Right. Thank you. Well, you did a great job of going issue by issue through the problems that have to be overcome through a STF Damascus, sort of agreement. I think one of the biggest ones that I've seen is that until now, it seems to me that there's been very little that Ashara hasn't had to share power with any other armed groups or any other groups, right, to actually cede control to others. And I'm just wondering, and maybe Gareth, this is a good way to segment over to you. Is it going to be possible to do that, to extend government control without some kind of real power sharing agreement between Damascus and the SDF? I mean, the SDF is used to having a large degree of autonomy and a large number of troops under arms, including with the United States. Are we going to see a similar model, you think, extended as we've seen in the western part of Syria, or will Ashara have to cut new kinds of deals with broader outlines to consolidate his power in northeast Syria?
I think whatever the deal with the SDF is going to be different to anything elsewhere in Syria. And I also think it's likely, one, it's something that he's not in a rush to finish. He's happy to sort of kick this down the road. In some ways, he has far more pressing things to deal with in other parts of the country. I think there's a pretty strong mutual respect between Mazloum Abdi and Ahmed Ashara. Man to man, the two leaders, I think they get on well personally. And I would say one thing I've really picked up on in Damascus is federalism for many Syrians is a really dirty word. And they almost see it as akin to partition. But they have a problem with the word. And, the reality is that almost certainly some power is going to stay with the Kurdish authorities. So it'll be federalism to some degree. Just don't call it that around certain people, because it will tick them off. This year deadline is probably not wise, but I think that's a bad habit that Shadow's government has sort of picked up on, is setting these arbitrary deadlines. When they launched the investigation into the coastal violence, they had this team of very competent lawyers who were supposed to report back within 30 days. And if you speak to them, they say, this is our 9/11 commission. How could we do it in a month? It's absolutely ridiculous. So I think it's sort of, it plays to his naivety and the government's naivety and inexperience as a government. But I think you can see a deal where power is essentially shared. I don't think Shadow and the people around him have the appetite to go into Hasakeh and other sort of largely Kurdish populated bits of Syria and take it over by force. And I also think that Shadow's going, in the last 5 months, he's had a few opportunities to prove himself to the Americans as a good partner in counterterrorism, and I think he's done quite a good job. We had the ISIS threat on the Sayyidah Zainab shrine about 3 months ago. That was based on a US intelligence tip. We've seen semi-regular airstrikes against Haras al-Din, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate in northern Syria. I think Shaddad has made it clear, whether implicitly or explicitly, that he's not going to stand in the US and the coalition's efforts to go after ISIS or Al-Qaeda properly. And you know, I don't think anyone thinks that those threats are over. So in the coming months and years, he's going to have more opportunities to prove himself as a counterterrorism partner to not just the US, but the wider Western world. And there's no reason why that can't be done in a complementary fashion with the Kurds and the Kurdish forces, who you know, have done a very good job in recent years of stemming the ISIS threat. I mean, the risk is that they don't coordinate, they don't cooperate, and then you sort of create fault lines, something similar to, you know, an area like Kirkuk in Iraq, where you have sort of disputes over who actually controls the security in those areas. And it's in those sorts of environments that, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, could potentially thrive, you know, and be a disruptor, not just to the Syrian state, but to people and outside of the country. So I don't think he's going to rush to a solution here. And I think whatever solution ends up being the case will be de facto. It won't be some, you know, carefully choreographed written statement. It will probably end up being some weird result of reality and facts on the ground that just sort of becomes a reality. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because that's probably the best way to avoid any sort of violence between Damascus and the Kurds.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. So let's get into the question and answer. We have about approximately a little less than 15 minutes to go. So we have a number of questions from online, as well as others who have sent them in via email. So let's start out in generalities. We've talked a lot about what's going on inside of Syria. How have the interim government's relations been with neighboring countries? Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Turkey. Aaron, how do you see it? I realize that's a lot of, but if you could quickly address what you see, where are things going well? Where are they problematic, and why?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk a while about each country, but I mean, generally speaking, they have a very good relationship with Turkey. Turkey's trying to, you know, stabilize the country for many reasons, including a lot related to their own domestic politics. But that's probably the closest country that Syria has as an ally right now. This could potentially change with, you know, the U.S. easing sanctions and allowing other countries to maybe balance Turkey's influence, such as Saudi or the Emirates potentially. In terms of Lebanon, because of the weaknesses of Hezbollah, they've been able to develop a better relationship with the Lebanese government. They're talking about border demarcation. There's been some coordination related to Hezbollah and smuggling networks. As for Jordan, I mean, so far it's been a cordial relationship. The Jordanians are definitely happy that there isn't this free flow of Captagon going across the border. Of course, it's still a problem, as Caroline has talked about, but at least there's a government in charge now that they can work with. It also can help out with some of the, you know, economic activity in Jordan too, in terms of easing the populations going back and forth across each other's borders. I don't know if you mentioned Iraq, but it's been an interesting relationship just because of Shara's history, of course, previously being a part of al-Qaeda in Iraq and having been imprisoned, and therefore they've had to get over some of that history. But it seems, at least now, there is some level of dialogue. They also want to work on many border issues related to trafficking, drugs, humans, terrorism. They both obviously are against ISIS, and Shara seems to be heading to Baghdad soon, I think, for an Arab League meeting coming up. And so it seems that that relationship's improving. The most complicated relationship from neighbors definitely has been Israel. Israel is kind of using its post-10/7 world to kind of flex its muscles, but also they're afraid that another 10/7 scenario can happen, even though I think it's a mistake to carbon copy sort of what happened in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon and say that that's how HTS is in many ways. But because of that, there's been more of a sticks approach than a carrots approach. And we've seen that with airstrikes, incursions, even one near the presidential palace last week, which they never did once during Assad's slaughter of the country. And part of it is also driven by the Israeli Druze population too, putting pressure on the Israeli government and perceiving to want to protect the Syrian Druze population. But as Gareth noted, it is, most, I think, Druze, in my own experiences on the ground when I talk to people, was that they don't want Israel's assistance. And they also question, where was Israel when Assad was in power? They didn't do anything when ISIS attacked them. And then there was, of course, the protest movement in the years ahead of the fall of the regime. And so it would make more sense if Israel had more of its good neighbor approach as it had a decade ago, and tried to work something out, because there is a huge opportunity here strategically, since both the Syrian government and Israelis do not like Iran, do not like Hezbollah. Of course, as we've already talked about, the counterterrorism related to the Sunni jihadi groups too. And so it's an opportunity to further sort of the victories that they had over Hezbollah's networks this past fall too. And so while it's totally understandable from their own experiences over the last couple of years that they'd have a bit more paranoia in some ways about an Islamist group now being in power in Syria, but at least for me, I see more opportunities than threats, at least at this juncture.
Okay. Caroline, Gareth, you want to chime in on that at all?
Yeah.
Just one quick point as well. I think just in regards to what we've seen with Israeli strikes, I also think that it's a reaction to now a lack of a coordination mechanism and deconfliction mechanism that they had with Russia and the regime, particularly in the south. Which I think also creates opportunity for trying to create some deconfliction mechanisms. I think that that's something that had been key. And as a result, now with this new change in Syria, that's why we've seen, some of these Israeli strikes, encroachment through the Golan Heights. And then, of course, as Aaron mentioned too, these kind of narratives of protecting minority groups. And so I think that hopefully over time, we'll see greater engagement and interest demonstrated in trying to create some of these deconfliction mechanisms, especially as Turkey is also trying to establish a footprint in the country. And we, of course, saw this kind of dance over the T4 base. And that was something that I think also created a greater need for deconfliction and communication, because accidents certainly can happen. And that is definitely a concern.
Okay. Gareth,
Yeah. I think I've been amazed at al-Shara's restraint when it came to Gaza and talking publicly about the Palestinians. And I've been amazed in private meetings with senior HTS members of them bringing up Israel. And okay, they're not saying we want to normalize and join the Abraham Accords, but they're saying we'd love to talk to them. Let's have dialogue. They're not rejecting it out of hand. And that's happened on multiple occasions. So I think there's a massive strategic opportunity for Israel, which I think Israel is absolutely squandering at the minute. And I think the biggest risk is that actually this risks becoming self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if the Israelis keep poking al-Shara, they keep poking the Syrians, they keep bombing Damascus and the south, at some point the domestic pressure on al-Shara is going to grow and he might react. And that would be bad for everyone.
Garrett, if I might just extend the next question, which I think leads from what we just discussed. So, Caroline, you mentioned that part of the rationale for Israeli intervention has been protection of minorities or in defense of minorities inside the country. Garrett, and then we can go to Aaron and Caroline. In your estimation, how much effective control does the Shara and the central government in Damascus have over the government-aligned militias that have been held responsible for sectarian violence thus far?
The great question. I think it's impossible to know the kind of true extent. I would say broadly he has pretty strong control of the spine of the country. So from Damascus all the way up to Idlib, and then the key cities in the coastal regions. Where it gets a bit more delicate is the rural areas outside of the main cities in Latakia and Tartus. And I think you have to look at every faction, every militia is different. even the foreign ones, and some are easier to control for various reasons, and some are more problematic, and they're not always for the reasons that you might think. So I'll give you like just a few quick examples. You know, the Uyghur faction, the Turkestan Islamic Party, they're one of the most sort of notorious foreign groups in Syria. But I also think on the ground they're actually a lot less problematic than some of the other foreign factions. They're delicate for al-Shara because he feels an incredible sense of loyalty for him because they really saved him in 2019 during the regime offensive. They held out in Jisr Shahur. I drove that road from Latakia to Jisr Shahur a few weeks ago, and it's just downhill, and that should have been a very easy punch in for Assad's 4th Division into Western Idlib and then into, you know, the cities of Idlib proper. You know, and these foreign fighters bailed him out. And to put it frankly, would he have won this without the foreign fighters? Probably not. Now, that doesn't make their behavior acceptable, but in some cases, with certain groups, he feels a very, very significant sense of personal loyalty to them. So that makes it very hard for him to just dismiss them, throw them out, hand them over to China, wherever. Obviously, he has to balance that with international interests. You know, I think one of the really problematic factions led by Abu Amsha, the Suleiman Shah brigades, that probably one of his biggest headaches, and that's a Syrian faction. That's not a foreign faction, and no doubt they're involved in violence in the coastal areas, but there's personal issues. Now, I think in the first month or two, the sort of logic from the defense ministry and al-Shara was, we need to keep these guys as close as we can. You know, better to have them inside the tent than outside the tent, let's say. And you know, they made a big mistake in December when they appointed the foreigners to key positions in the Ministry of Defense. And I think had that list of 8 demands come before they had done that, they probably wouldn't have done that. And I suspect they wouldn't do it again. But, you know, he doesn't have the luxury of being able to pick and choose his fighters on the ground. He simply doesn't have enough of a Syrian HTS hardcore. You know, we're talking maybe less than 50,000 fighters. So he, at the minute, is reliant on some of these problematic actors. He can't cast them all out. But I think if he can get the ball rolling, if he can improve the economic situation, if he can stabilize the security situation, then he can wean himself off them and incorporate them into the government security apparatus, which will give him a far better ability to control them and hold them accountable for the crimes that they've been involved in.
Great. So one very last question. We only have 2 minutes left. And I have to ask it because it's come through multiple times, and we have fellows here who deal with it in depth, and it's been a big focus of the U.S. on Syria over the last few years. What's going to happen to the Russian bases in Syria? What do we know? Are they going to stay open, closed? What's the latest?
I think it's TBD.
TBD, okay.
But the Russians are just hanging out there for now. I think they're kind of waiting out to see what kind of happens with the engagements that the new government's having with Europe, as well as potentially with the US. I mean, for now, I don't think that they're going to ask them to leave, since they're helping out with some oil that's passing the sanctions from Russia. They're also printing the currencies. Though maybe the meeting today between Shara and Macron will shift the currency from being printed in Moscow to Paris, since that's been rumored, which would be helpful. But I think until things potentially change on the sanctions front vis-a-vis the US, they're going to hold that card there for some time.
Great. Anybody else have any insights on what happens to the Russians in Syria?
I can have a go as well.
Sure.
Caroline, first, Caroline.
Go ahead, Garrett.
Yeah, no, well, I spent some time with the HTS officials responsible for negotiations with the Russians. And I think there's a high chance that the Russian presence stays, but it's massively consolidated. So essentially you have 2 points of Russian presence now. You have the port, and then you have the airbase at Hamamim. But this is not particularly Hamamim, it's essentially just an overflight stop for Russian flights going to Africa, i.e. Libya. And you sort of see, if you're following on Twitter, the local Syrian news, you'll see, ships arriving from Russia, sort of embers of commercial relations between Damascus and Moscow. And as Aaron says, I think that's a sort of temporary thing until there's wider movement on the sanctions. I think HTS have been incredibly pragmatic. I don't think they want to have a flourishing relationship with the Russians. They will do if they can get some easy wins out of it. But I think they'd much rather look west. But until they sort of get assurances, I think they're not going to chase the Russians out. I think the good news is, from a sort of US or Western perspective, is that all of these relations so far between Assad and the Russians are very easily undoable. There's sort of no permanence. Oh, and there goes my power. There's no permanence to this relationship.
Wow.
Welcome to
Yeah. Gareth, you're really putting it on the line there. Caroline, any last words on this?
Just a brief comment about what Gareth, what he was talking about with foreign fighters. During my trip, we had a meeting with a former opposition fighter who is now within the MOD. And it was, a very late night dinner. And there was a point where we approached the topic of foreign fighters. And I'll never forget what he said. And I think that Gareth, this is exactly, it hits the nail on the head of your point. It's essentially, they said, look, these are fighters from our perspective that came to Syria, left their country, established families, established a life here. And while we've embedded them within the bureaucracy of some of our ministries, particularly the Ministry of Defense, you want us to suddenly disband and kick them out? How do you expect we do this? And I think that there needs to be a bit more clarification, as well as handholding and engagement with outside governments. Because if there is an expectation of, all right, we need to push these foreign fighters out, there needs to be a strategy exactly how you can do that, and also how you can mitigate the fallout. Because in this conversation, they were also talking about, look, these are effective, experienced fighters that have the capacity to coordinate attacks, to coordinate challenges inside of Syria. And that's just something that we do not have the capacity and we do not have the patience to deal with right now. So I think that is an area of opportunity. Certainly that expectation has been put out. It is a problem. It is a concern for the USG. But it also represents, I think, an opportunity for clarification.
Yeah, and at least at a minimum on Ashara's case, actually, if he wants to dump these foreign fighters, then he's going to have to share power with fellow Syrians. And as an organization which has claimed to be a nationalist organization, I think that probably has traditionally weighed heavily on his thinking. So it's going to be interesting to see how that's operationalized.
Andrew, can I just make one more point on the foreign fighters?
Absolutely, sure.
2 lines. I'm thinking from a Western security perspective, the Syrian government has essentially said they're going to take responsibility for all the foreign fighters. So these thousands of people which governments across Europe and the world have for the last 6-7 years said, we don't want anything to do them. Someone has come forward and said, we're going to take responsibility. They're going to become Syrian citizens and they're going to follow our laws. In some ways, he's taking care of the sort of the human jihadist detritus that governments in Europe haven't wanted to touch for the last 5 years. So here's a solution out of nowhere for Europe.
Okay. Wow. And on that very interesting twist, I'd like to thank Aaron, Caroline, and Gareth for your time, and to everybody in the audience for listening. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. We have a couple of questions on Iran and its meddling in Syria, but we can always hook up later about that. Thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to the next policy forum here at the Washington Institute.